TheCinemaRanger here. I've been watching Westworld lately. Took a while, but I finally got through season 2. My overall opinion of that season is it starts off very slow. It was very difficult to get through the first 3 episodes or so. But after that, it started to pick up, and by the end, I was as hooked as I was with the first season. You know, my thoughts about Westworld, I got a couple different ideas I wanted to just discuss while I'm out here. I guess for starters, you know, in sort of thinking about the name of the show, Westworld, and thinking about some of the basic themes that it's wrestling with, one idea that sort of struck me, especially while watching season 2, because I was curious how they would handle this, is the idea that, you know, the West, mythically and classically, is kind of, you know, it represents this idea of the frontier and the dying frontier. And so in some ways, the merger of science fiction and the Western is kind of very ideal, because both of these genres wrestle with the frontier, and yet in the age we live in, the kind of, you know, the age of information, where everything is, you know, broken apart and analyzed, and we have people doing what I do, where they tear everything down and kind of assess its meaning. You're left with this interesting question, like, what are our frontiers of narrative, or what are our frontiers in general? You know, if we look at society, certainly we're exploring social frontiers, and to a limited extent you can see some of that play out in the show. But, you know, the real question with a show like Westworld is, well, what is the narrative frontier? Like, what is the thing we haven't seen before? We've got hybrid genres across the board. We've got all kinds of innovative storytelling techniques where, you know, in the season 2, different timelines are played with and explored. But you're left with this question, like, how far can you go with that? And is that actually innovative, or is it just a gimmick? And to that end, I thought Westworld is sort of toying with something very interesting, very original, very new and distinct. I don't know if they can actually do anything with this idea, but it's there. It's kind of being hinted at on the fringes of the show. A frontier possibility that the show can never actually deliver on, because after all, the theme of the frontier is so important. Let me get back to some of the things that go on in season 2, though, that I do think show the capacity of this show to kind of move into new territory, at least in its own terms. The first season is very much driven by the motifs and ideals of the Western. The white hat, black hat, showdowns, that sort of thing. The good characters, bad characters, the frontier, the plains, Indians, you name it. And so season 2, if the show is truly going to be about the frontier, has to do something different. It can't just be a rehash of Western motifs done with some different characters and some different plots. I think to a certain extent they were able to deliver on that. And so what the show does is, rather than sort of revisit the same sort of Western ideals that we had seen in season 1, season 2 has this kind of biblical arc to it. And there's a lot of biblical symbolism in the film, in the show. You know, from the Forge being this kind of underworld environment, and then you have the sort of god and devil-like characters that Dolores and Bernard take on at the end of the show, at the end of the season. Of course, they open that gate to this heaven-like place at the end of season 2. Some characters go through and some characters don't. Clementine is like this pale horse, big death figure wading through the crowds. So, and then of course with William, Ed Harris's character, we see him descending into the bowels of hell at the end. Not really sure what's happened to him just yet. Perhaps that'll be answered soon. But bottom line is, what they did is, rather than sort of regurgitate a series of Western mythos, they brought in a kind of biblical narrative, an apocalyptic narrative, and pushed the show to a new frontier, as it were. And what we're seeing in season 3 is a similar interest in pushing the frontier boundary. That this season is this kind of poetic, heavy-duty sci-fi extravaganza. It reminds me more of Blade Runner 2049 than Westworld, really. There's been almost no hint of the Western element. It's all sci-fi. It's got this sort of overpowering music, beautifully, achingly beautiful compositions. It's sci-fi poetry. I don't know if it'll mean anything, but it's very beautiful. And so I'm pleased, on the one hand, at least in terms of utilizing genre elements, we're seeing some real innovation by the show writers to keep pushing Westworld in new directions. You see, from the very beginning, Westworld has sort of entertained itself with an exploration of what does it mean to have advanced AI, and this is obviously, you know, the dominant theme. Plenty of scenes in which characters wrestle with the nature of consciousness, what it means to be alive, sometimes cynical, sometimes not. Anthony Hopkins Ford concludes in season 1 that consciousness is just a story we tell ourselves and it doesn't really exist. And it's a sort of compelling thought that he brings up there, that there really is no differentiation between our consciousness and the consciousness of any other living thing. We just happen to have language, and the language allows us to sort of define that consciousness as something that it's really not. But what intrigues me about season 2, and what I think, you know, again, the show sort of entertains the promise of something truly new, but it's a promise that it will be unable to deliver on because of the nature of making a big expensive show on a studio, in a studio like HBO. And that promise is, what does it mean when the characters escape the overlords of their narrative? Over and over, you know, Dolores and all these different characters, I'm forgetting some of their names now, but they seem to be so fascinated with the idea of somehow getting away from the storyteller, of getting away from the lines that have been written for them so they can be free. And to different extents, they struggle or succeed at this. But from a meta perspective, these characters will never be able to escape the life that they are stuck in. They are characters created, fictional characters created for an audience, and therefore they will always, by necessity, be prisoners of their destiny. They must be characters in a written show. And I can't help but feel like the writers of the show know that. The Westworld writers want to somehow break into this truly new frontier in which the characters in a story are genuinely independent and free to create story on their own, but they know they can't. And that's why we see the writer get killed at the end of season 2. Well, we can assume he gets killed, because the writer represents the narrator. He represents the story writers of the show themselves. And so his death is kind of like a meta nod to the idea that the true frontier that this show really wants to get to isn't just tweaking genre, introducing Shogun warriors, or having us go on some sort of World War II spy romance kind of thing. The true frontier is characters in a story taking control of the story themselves and dictating its outcome through their own choices. In some ways, I think this is every writer's fantasy, to breathe such great life into their characters that the heavy hand of their narrative impulse is kind of removed. Maybe I shouldn't say every writer, but I think a lot of writers are intrigued by this idea of giving characters so much vitality that we're almost no longer needed, or perhaps not needed at all. And to me, that is the meta symbolism of the death of the writer. Of course, the tragedy of this is it's not possible. The show, it's a written show, and it's for a big studio that has needs, and as innovative as HBO tends to be, they're still ultimately going to be limited by, you know, audience expectations, what they can really truly want to deliver on, and the sort of, you know, the frailty of the writers that write the show. And then the hard, cold fact is that writers are still necessary. The only way, I think, in theory, for this show to truly deliver on its promise is to take all these character concepts, to take the plot, to take the show, to feed it all into some sort of advanced AI, and let the AI figure out how it all ends. That would be the frontier, groundbreaking thing that Westworld could do. That would be something we have never, at least as far as I know, really seen before. The problem, of course, is even if that AI software existed, the showrunners would probably never allow their baby, this sort of money-generating thing, to just be handed over to a computer to determine its outcome. Unless, of course, the computer was able to provide a very interesting and innovative outcome. But this, to me, sort of raises the final point I want to make about Westworld, is those of us who are interested in the show, I think we're hungry for the possibility of new frontiers. I know I am, as a wannabe explorer. I hunger for the unknown, to whatever extent I can get it. I try to find it. In my case, a little bit of travel and deep diving into whatever I can see in a show or a movie But to me, Westworld hints at this incredible frustration that all writers, storytellers, and lovers of story must deal with right now, which is that we are fundamentally limited by the imagination of the creators. And so AI promises the potential of a kind of storytelling in which that limitation is no longer a problem. And Westworld hints at that. I think it's a fascinating premise. I'd love to see it truly manifest, but we'll see. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I'm the Cinema Ranger. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I hope our paths cross someday.